Okay, and we are live on Facebook. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another New Jersey Constitutional Republicans virtual conversation. It's once again my great pleasure to have Michael Zach joining me, the writer and author of the book, Back to Basics for the Republican Party. Thank you, Michael, for joining me again.
Thanks very much for John Roberts. An honor to be on your program.
And Michael, please give us a brief bio for those who may not have seen our first episode. This is the second episode. We'll be discussing the chapter, A Grand New Party, which will be highlighting the history, the initial history of the Republican Party. But Michael, please give us a little bit of a background.
Sure. Well, thanks very much. I'm originally from Chicago, and I was in the State Department, and that allowed me to look back at our country from a foreign perspective. That helped clarify some things for me. Then I was in banking around the world, and then I decided, hey, it's time to do what I was meant to do, which is to write this book, Back to Basics for the Republican Party. It's a civil rights history of the GOP. Or another way to look at it is it's a pro-GOP history of the GOP, which is very rare. And so then I also keep a blog called GrandOldPartisan.com. Grand Old Partisan. Each day it celebrates Republican heroes and heroics. So every day at Grand Old Partisan, there's a short bio of some forgotten hero or some bit of a good deed that the Republican Party has done, or sometimes I highlight Democrat villainy, but it's all about promoting the heritage of the GOP.
Right, Michael, why do you think it's so important that this book and the daily posts that you put out on the Grand Old Partisan, why do you think it's so important to get that information out to the people?
Well, the Democrats play a very long game. They've been doing it since slave days, is to increase their power, subjugate their enemies, and steal their stuff. And Republicans usually don't understand that that's what the Democrats not only are doing now, but have always done. And a strong reason of why that's possible for Democrats to get away with it is Republicans don't understand what's going on. They don't understand the heritage, the history of this country from the Republican Party point of view. They don't understand that the Republican Party has been a terrific force for good in this country, and in a lot of ways has made this country great, partly by just preventing or slowing down Democrat depravity. So I'm trying to get Republicans to appreciate the heritage of the GOP, celebrate heroes of the party from the past, and to see the contemporary time as just the latest chapter in a saga since 1854. So that's what I'm trying to get the Republican Party to get back to basics.
Outstanding. And of course, Michael, you know that the constitutional Republicans are perfectly in line with your objectives. And I want to share with the people, not particularly that page, but I wanted to share with the people the book, where they can get the book. And of course, they can find that on Amazon. There it is, Back to Basics for the Republican Party. Paperback edition today is being sold for the very, very affordable price of $16.95. And there you have it, Back to Basics for the Republican Party, third edition paperback. And this came out on February 25th, 2003, correct, Michael?
Correct. And I've given speeches in 31 states around the country, or 37 states around the country, about the heritage of the GOP and making the book available to people. So it's been a great success.
There's no question about it. And we certainly are going to do, and have begun with our first episode, a deep dive into the book, to where we don't want to give all the secrets away, Michael, in the book, but we want to highlight, and we want to talk about what important information that is included in the book that many Republicans don't even know. And this is what is so alarming is that we need to be able to articulate what we believe as Republicans. So often, Michael, and you've already alluded to this, is that we're always working in almost as a reaction or as a reactionary party. We're always on the defensive, being Republicans. And I know you believe, and I believe, that we need to go on the offensive. And the time now is to do that. And we have a tremendous amount of pride that we can take in the accomplishments and in the philosophy of the Republican Party, right?
Absolutely correct. And as I'd like to say, the more we Republicans know about the history of our party, the more the Democrats will worry about the future of theirs.
That's an outstanding quote. And you conclude each one of your lessons in the for the blog each day, which I really enjoy, and we've been posting them up. So look for them on our NJCR page. Go to Michael's blog. He's each day he's sharing information on that. Just wanted to see if I could bring up. Not quite able to get that at this moment.
It's grandoldpartisan.com.
Right, the grandoldpartisan.com. Well, I'll get that up
Just
prior to the end of it.
Right. Okay. Grandoldpartisan.com. So
grandoldpartisan.com, and that is the blog, and that is what he is sharing. And each day I'm learning, and I consider myself a fairly knowledgeable historian of the Republican Party. But Michael Zach is providing me and all Republicans with a great education each day, with Republicans who we've never even heard of, but were heroes of the Republican Party, whether it was the first governor or the first representative in some of the southern states. We see very influential Black women who were Republicans, Black representatives who were elected early on, just as Reconstruction started. So there's a tremendous amount of information that Mike is putting out, and we really appreciate that. And people need to go there and to learn about these great heroes of the Republican Party.
That's right. Thank you.
So with that said, Michael, yes. And so with that said, Michael, let's look into the chapter in your book, Back to Basics for the Republican Party. And essentially the first episode, we went over an overview that's provided an all-encompassing view of the Republican Party from its origination right up until today. But today we're going to look at the historical foundation of the party, Chapter 2, and it's included a grand new party, and the years are 1848 to 1861. Of course, 1848, we had the election of Zachary Taylor, who was the Whig president elect at the time, and he wanted to hand over the responsibilities. He was actually very constitutional in the respect, Michael, that he believed that the Congress needed to set the agenda, totally different from the progressive mindset of the executive office we have today. But let's talk about this infamous piece of legislation that was never passed by both houses, but had such a profound impact on creating the environment from which civil war would eventually come, and that's the Will Not Proviso. Talk to us about that.
All right. It was introduced to Congress by a Republican congressman named David Wilmot from Pennsylvania. And by the way, he went on to write he went on to be the principal writer of the Republican National Platform in 1856. So in 1848 or 1846, actually, he introduced a bill saying during the Mexican War, saying any land that the United States would conquer from Mexico would not have slavery in it. And that made the whole country sit up and pay attention, because it was, well, what is this country going to expand? Is slavery going to expand in this country as the country expands, or is it going to remain just a local institution in the South? So that became very clear. If this country is going to be all slave or all free, that the Will Not Proviso made it very clear to people it's going to be A or B. There's nothing in between. And as a result of that, David Wilmot became famous, and as a result of that, also the Whig Party, which had been the opposition to the Democratic Party, started to split because they were refused. The Democrats became the pro-slavery party. They opted, yes, we're in favor of slavery. The Whigs were like, oh, we don't know. And as a result, because of the Will Not Proviso, was very weakened and eventually collapsed and was replaced by the very anti-slavery Republican Party. So the Will Not Proviso began the whole thing, and that's why I began the chapter on the origin of the Republican Party. I begin it with the Will Not Proviso. And again, the chapter, yeah, you mentioned, the chapter is called A Grand New Party, because that's what it was.
That's true. That's exactly right. And now we're discussing the foundation or the environment that was created, that initially created the party, the environment that existed, and it had to do with slavery from the very beginning. And of course, we read about the great Daniel Webster, who is one of my great heroes and should be for all Republicans, the great Whig senator from Massachusetts, who incidentally, Charles Sumner replaced him. And of course, Charles Sumner is one of our great radical Republican heroes, who we look back to. And yeah, he's on the cover of the book. That's right. And I initially
Republican Party.
That's right. And I initially became aware of your book, Michael, as a result of seeing a picture of the book and noticing the great Thaddeus Stevens, who we're going to be talking about, and Charles Sumner, along with Abraham Lincoln and Ronald Reagan.
Right.
And this is why these men often have been historically neglected by our party, with the exception, of course, Lincoln in many regards, and Reagan more contemporarily. However, the people don't know a whole lot about Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens. And as you listen to these editions, listen to these virtual conversations with Michael Zach, you're going to learn a lot more about them. But of course, right from the 1820s, of course, we had the Great Compromise, initiated by the great Henry Clay, who was a great mentor of Abraham Lincoln. He was the great compromiser. But you had Daniel Webster on the other side, who was representing free soil, representing abolition. And then on the other side, you had representing the slave power was John Calhoun, who was very, very powerful in the Southern and was a defender of the slave power. So you had Daniel Webster on one side and John Calhoun on the other. Henry Clay sort of stuck a middle ground. And then, of course, we talk about what happened with another compromise that occurred in 1850. And then talk to us, Michael, about the impact that the Fugitive Slave Act had on creating this environment from which the Republican Party would come from.
Right. Let me back up one little thing about Daniel Webster. He was famous for a terrific phrase which became a standard within the Republican Party, which was liberty and union, now and forever, one and inseparable.
Yes.
So
I get goosebumps when I hear that.
Magnificent. And
if he was here today, Michael, he would be saying the same exact thing.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. So you're right. Those three men exemplified the debate that was going on. And then we had the Fugitive Slave Act, which was basically any slave catchers could arrest any black person in the North, and with just an affidavit, no criminal process whatsoever, chain them up and bring them to the South. So you could be walking down the street in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and some guy puts handcuffs on you and drags you away and makes you pick cotton in Alabama. And it just was shocking to any friend of freedom in the North. So when the Democrats would talk about, well, the state's right to have slavery, yeah, but how about the person's right to walk down the street unmolested in Minneapolis, Minnesota? Well, they forget about that. So it was slavery. This country, the Fugitive Slave Act made it very clear this country is going to be all slave or all free. And a lot of a lot of northern state governments refused to have anything to do with the Fugitive Slave Act. They wouldn't They wouldn't cooperate with it whatsoever. And so that became very clear that the slavery was expanding throughout the whole country. And let me say something else about slavery. It wasn't, there were a lot of pro-slavery Democrats in the South who were talking about extending slavery to poor whites as well.
Yes.
We think of it as slavery nowadays as it's just white and black, but there were a lot of rich Democrats who were very open. They wanted to enslave poor white people too, and chain them up and make them work in mines and factories and so forth. And they're all excited. We're going to industrialize the South by enslaving all these white people and making them work for free. So it was just like a cancer, slavery that was growing and growing. And Republicans just said, all right, that's enough. This has got to stop. And that gave rise to the formation of the GOP. Now, do you want me to go ahead and talk about that?
Yeah, certainly. I just wanted, exactly. I just wanted to add that, so we see here this, the continuing on of this argument that lasted for decades over essentially slave labor or free labor. And the Fugitive Slave Act, and incidentally, there were many free blacks that were allowed to vote in some of the states prior to this Fugitive Slave Act.
Correct.
And they were part of the community. They worked, they earned their own living, and yet they could essentially be captured and then taken and then sold into slavery. And this was a federal law, which was even more remarkable, because the states held a lot more sovereignty in certain respects prior to the Civil War. But this was just an atrocity, and people were completely, they were befuddled by such an unjust law. And the other thing too, Michael, it's important to share with the people, is that these Southern slaveholders, and we'll talk about this with the Dred Scott decision, considered these people not as people, but as property. Correct. Concerning the black slaves, which violates the laws of nature and nature's God, by which our founders used to justify or to entitle the creation of our nation. So it was going against the very, very foundations.
Democrats were, yes, the nation was born with slavery, but the founders were very careful. They didn't say slavery. They didn't want to enshrine that in the document. They said persons held to service and so forth, because as Lincoln pointed out later, the founders of this country expected slavery to fade away. And yet by the 1850s, and the Democrats were very pro-slavery.
Michael, they codified the end of slavery in the Constitution after 20 years, I believe, from 1793.
Right. Well, yeah, that slavery could be
1789, rather.
Right. They said that after until 1908 or 1808, the federal government could ban the importation of slavery. So yeah, it was codified that it would eventually go away. But by the 1850s, the Democrats were gung-ho for slavery, and they said not only blacks but poor whites as well. And they were talking about invading Latin America and the Democrats were talking about enslaving all of Latin America. It was just insane. And Republicans said, all right, none of that. And so basically, when people like talk about where the Republican Party began, well, let me back up. The Democratic Party today began pretty much in one room. It began as the re-election campaign of Andrew Jackson. You can pick very clearly, that's the formation of the Democratic Party, was the re-election campaign. Whereas the Republican Party began more or less like the Tea Party. It just sort of sprang up across the country in opposition to the Democrats. Now let's talk about the Kansas-Nebraska Act, shall we? Can we skip ahead to that? Okay, Kansas-Nebraska Act. That was basically passed by the Democrats with some Whig collaboration. Said basically, well, the two main problems with it. One was it said that slavery could be extended into the Western territories, and by that I mean Dakota, Montana, Nebraska, Kansas, all of that. Nevada, and Democrats are gung ho for it. They're, wow, think of all the silver mines that we could open up with slave labor and so forth. And think of all the plantations in Kansas. It's crazy to think about it, but that could have happened. And that was the catalyst to the formation of the Republican Party. When that passed across the country, across the North at least, people were friends of freedom, I like to say, were just said, all right, that's it. We're done compromising with these people because it'll never stop. So rallies and meetings and conventions just arose within the North. What can we do to stop this? And they realized that the old framework of the Whig Party wasn't going to do it, because the Whig Party, the Democrats had adopted a lot of the Whig Party's economic policies, so there wasn't a whole lot that the Whig Party itself offered. And plus, the Whig Party had Southern wing that they didn't want to anger with slavery. So people said, we have to start over and form a new party. And of course, the famous meeting in Ripon, Wisconsin, that was one of the first times, or maybe the first time, the word Republican was used. And then a few months later, we had the state convention in Michigan. That was the first formation of the annual part of the organization. And very, very fast, throughout the northern states, town meetings, counties organized Republican parties, and then they stitched themselves together into a state Republican Party. And then very quickly, there was a meeting in Pittsburgh in order to affiliate all the state Republican parties together. And at that meeting, they created the Republican National Committee. And that Republican National Committee then organized the first Republican National Convention that nominated John Fremont for president. And by the way, when people talk about how the Republicans were so so northern dominated, the first Republican presidential nominee was from Savannah, Georgia.
That's
John
true.
Fremont was as southern as you could possibly be, and he was the first Republican presidential candidate. So the Republican Party arose very, very quickly. From 1854, within 2 years, had formed itself as a national party. And then 2 years after that, in 1858, won control of the U.S. House of Representatives. So went from nothing to control of the House in 4 years and setting itself up for the presidency. Because why did it go so fast? Because the time had arrived. Everyone realized that the moment is now. And so, as I say in the book, the Republican Party was created to defend the Constitution and save the country. Defend the Constitution for the Democratic Party and save the country from the Democratic Party. And we have to remember that. So we had a whole bunch of leaders of the party arise. We had Thaddeus Stevens. I guess now is a good time. Well, let's talk about Charles Sumner, of course. Charles Sumner was the abolitionist senator from Massachusetts who was beaten almost to death on the floor of the U.S. Senate by a Democrat congressman who had walked in and almost killed him. And it hurt him so badly. Preston Brooks, who very soon died of pneumonia or something right after. So that was the end of him. But almost beat him almost to death for being against slavery. And then our friend Thaddeus Stevens, who I would say is the hero of Back to Basics of the Republican Party. I mean, Lincoln gets his due, but I think the real hero of my book is Thaddeus Stevens. And by the way, my book praised Thaddeus Stevens long before the Lincoln movie and anything else. It was way ahead of its time in appreciating this great man who some would say is the greatest Republican who ever lived. So, so you had a lot of heroes arise. You had Thaddeus Stevens, you had Henry Wilson, and Henry Wilson, who went on to be vice president. He was a ditch digger. He had dug ditches, and he worked his way up to vice president of the United States. And he understood the value of labor, the dignity of labor, and he understood that under the slave system, guys like him who started off digging ditches were regarded as trash. The manual labor was disparaged by the Democrats because, well, hey, we have slaves to do that. And he realized that's a sickness in our country. So he said he devoted his life, Henry Wilson, to stopping that. So, and I think it was Henry Wilson, I think so. He was the one who eventually wrote the DC Emancipation Act that freed the slaves in Columbia. He was a great man. So you had all these different heroes of the party. And what I do in my book is I give a good emphasis to the congressional leaders of the early Republican Party.
Mhm.
Lyman Trumbull, on and on and
Yes.
on. Yeah, Lyman
Salmon
Trumbull
Chase.
shot. Yeah, Salmon Chase. Lyman Trumbull wrote the 13th Amendment to ban slavery. He was a great man.
Mhm.
And the reason I do that is I want to give proper Democrat historians overemphasize Lincoln. And I don't mean any disrespect to that great man, but they do that in order to remove him from his context as a Republican. They like to
Yes.
describe him sort of as this like mythological figure who descended from the clouds and freed the slaves and was gone. Absurd. He was GOP. And he was, you could say, first among equals of a whole bunch of great Republican visionaries, like the guys I mentioned, Stevens and Chase and so forth. So once I lay out these the achievements in the context of these other great Republicans, then I talk about Lincoln. And Lincoln, by the way, was one of the last major figures of the Whig Party to join the Republican Party.
He was.
He was very devoted to the Whig Party, and he only left it when it was pretty much dead. And he joined the GOP and helped get it going in Illinois. But it had already been a party for 2 years before Lincoln joined it. So,
Michael,
yes,
Michael,
sir.
I just wanted to interject that you write in the book that before settling on the Whig Party as a name, opponents of Andrew Jackson had called themselves the National Republicans. So there is a thread there between the Whigs and the Republican Party, and of course Lincoln personified that, as well as Thaddeus Stevens. Thaddeus Stevens was also a Whig representative of as well prior to the Republican Party. And I think it's very interesting that you say in the book, and this is something that most people are not aware of, but really the Republican Party, with the idea of the Free Soil Party, with the Whigs, the abolitionist Whigs, and so forth. But really, what they were the very best of Jeffersonian and Hamiltonian philosophies, combining that first Republican's defense of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness with the Whigs' Hamiltonian agenda for economic growth, which we understood as the American system. So that's
right.
very well put in the book.
Thank you. Yeah, Jefferson, followers of Thomas Jefferson called themselves Republicans. So the name was, the name was well, actually, followers of Jefferson, the man, called themselves Republicans. And then as they allied with people in the North who agreed with them, they called themselves Democratic Republicans. But Jefferson himself called himself, in fact, in his inaugural address, remember, he said, "We're all Republicans, we're all Federalists." Like,
yes.
Together. So Jeffersonians called themselves Republicans. So the name Republican, when the party chose it, had this grand history already, and it was a perfect name for the GOP. And so when the Republican Party began, exactly as I mentioned in the book, it was a fusion of the best of Thomas Jefferson and the best of Alexander Hamilton. And so you can get a guy like Abraham Lincoln, who is a grand visionary for human rights, and yet he had come up through the Alexander Hamilton economic program. So Republicans then, and I argue in my book today, should understand that properly understood, a civil rights agenda and economic growth are inseparable. And so
True.
So when the Republican Party was, again, they lost the first presidential election in 1856, but they did very well, 33%. And the Republicans realized, hey, if to win next time, all we have to do is win Indiana and Illinois and Pennsylvania. And if we just win those 3 more states, we win. And so you had guys like William Seward, who were very big guys in New York, but they didn't have a whole lot of whole outside of New York, of the East. And so they said, all we have to do is win Indiana, Illinois, and Pennsylvania. Who do we know who's grew up in Indiana and lives in Illinois and resides in Illinois, And hey, boom, Abraham Lincoln. It was just obvious. And Pennsylvania, well, we'll just give them whatever they want to pull them in. And so it was pretty much, early Republicans saw it this way. They said, this is ordained by God. This is absolutely perfect to win the presidency. And then it became perfecter when the Democratic Party split and picked a Northern Democrat and a Southern Democrat. And they did that before Lincoln was nominated. So the Republicans were like, we got this. And they did. And again, Lincoln was nominated, and he was a former Whig, so they picked from the Midwest, so they picked a former Democrat from the East, Hannibal Hamlin as his vice president. So it was really perfect. If you read the writings of the time, Republicans really thought this is ordained by God. This is absolutely perfect, and it was.
Let me interject, if you would, Michael. What most people don't understand is that there actually exists, and Lincoln spoke in May of 1856 at the Illinois State Convention at Bloomington, Illinois, and what we know of as Lincoln's lost speech.
Right.
And wouldn't it be remarkable if we could discover that lost speech? Many say it was the best speech he ever gave in lieu of the Gettysburg Address.
Yeah,
it was
the keynote, his keynote address at the founding convention of the Illinois Republican Party. And again, he kind of winged it, and there was no written notes. And there are some snippets from reports, but there's no transcript of the speech or even close to it. And the popular folklore is that even the stenographers were so transfixed by it, they say, well, some other stenographer will get it. I just want to listen to the speech. But anyway, that really made him the major figure of the Illinois Republican Party. And that set him up to run for the US Senate, 2 years later. And
and just prior in 1855, another piece of information that people probably don't know about is the Know Nothing Party. And Lincoln wrote a famous passage, and you have it here in the book. And Lincoln said, as a nation, we began by declaring that all men are created equal. We now practically read it, all men are created equal except Negroes. When the know-nothings get control, it will read all men are created equal except Negroes and foreigners and Catholics,
right.
Unquote. Of course, the know-nothings were very, very anti-immigration. They wanted to cut it right off. And that was a very, very radical position. And of course, a lot of the know-nothings eventually became either Democrat or Republican, but Lincoln showing early on his moderate views and trying to reason with people who may hold a more radical position. And he understood the Declaration of Independence as meaning all men are created equal, and there aren't any modifiers or divisions or subdivisions in relation to that, the self-evident truth.
Oh, I agree. And it should be noted, the early from the beginning, Republican Party platforms were very pro-immigration. I don't think it has anything to do with what's going on today, but the lawlessness.
No.
But then, when people could apply to come here and so forth, and work once they got here, that was enshrined in their early Republican Party. So
and then go ahead. Let's talk about really what put Lincoln on the national map was the great debates that he had with Stephen A. Douglas.
Right. Well, I would say the most important. Stephen Douglas was the principal author of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which extended slavery into the Midwest and sparked creation of the Republican Party. And interestingly enough, Lincoln had known Stephen Douglas well before then. In fact, Stephen Douglas had courted Mary Todd. He had been running after Mary Todd before Lincoln. And it sounds like it's mythology, but it actually is true, attested from at the time. She sort of dumped Stephen Douglas when she met Lincoln. And she said at the time, to her girlfriend, she said, Abraham Lincoln will be president of the United States. And that's at a time when Stephen Douglas was already a U.S. Senator and Abraham Lincoln was nobody. But it's really true. So,
Yeah,
um,
quite amazing.
so they had 7 debates around the states. I think it was only the second time ever for a Senate election they had debates of any kind. Um, what's
And
interesting,
Stephen Douglas agreed to the debates too,
yeah, he
Michael.
agreed
He
to
agreed to
debate.
do it. He
He
didn't
really
have
didn't.
to do it.
He didn't
And
have to.
because he acquiesced, he created a national hero that we revere to the very moment.
Yeah, he could have refused, and that would have been the end of it. And Lincoln would have lost easy. But Stephen Douglas was an interesting guy. Yes, he through his wife owned a slave plantation in Mississippi, so he was a slave owner. Um, but in some ways, he was kind of a man of honor. He said, well, I'm not afraid to take on anybody, and the voters deserve to know what our policies are. In some ways, he's a great honorable man. In some ways,
Yeah, yes, he
um,
was.
and to me, the most striking thing about the Lincoln Douglas debates, which were 7 of them around the state, was all they talked about was slavery. That's it. They didn't talk about economic policy. They didn't talk about rising crime or anything, economic growth,
Right.
nothing. Every minute of the Lincoln Douglas debates was about slavery, because people understood that's all that mattered. Is this country going to be a slave hellhole, or is it going to be a free country? There weren't any other issues we're talking about. So um, the most important debate was the Freeport debate, in which, remember, the Democrats had 2 policies. One was slaves had no rights, or Black people had no rights whatsoever. And the other one was people could, and that people could own slaves no matter what other people thought. And the other policy was people in the territories are free to choose whether they can have slavery or not.
Popular sovereignty.
Yeah, well, there's a big contradiction there, isn't there? Well, which
Yes,
is it?
there is.
And Lincoln, being a fine lawyer, zoomed right in on it, pressed that button. Boom. Well, guys, which is it? You can't hold both policies. And Stephen Douglas said, well, people in the slaves in the territories could ban slavery by not passing slave laws, which is kind of a Weasley thing to do. But the Southern Democrats were shocked. What do you mean you can prevent slavery in any way? What? That cost him the presidential election in 1860. And that's, as I said, the Democrats split Northern and Southern candidates because the Southern Democrats said, we can't abide that. So in some ways, that won Abraham Lincoln the presidency, because that killed the Stephen Douglas presidential campaign. And who killed it? Well, Abraham Lincoln. So that vaulted him to national prominence. And we've all heard probably of his famous speech at the Cooper Union in New York. And that was his pretty much his first foray into the East Coast as a politician. And people in New York who were all for William Seward and so forth had never really met Abraham Lincoln. They were just stunned that, oh my God, who is this man? And that really, it made him everyone's second choice for the Republican presidential nomination in 1860. All the other titans had drawbacks to their candidacies, and Lincoln was like, he's the guy. So that, yeah, it defeated.
And also, Michael, 1858, rather, at the state convention in Illinois is when Lincoln delivered the famous House divided speeches, which is what you're talking about, saying that the country was either going to be all slave or no slave at all. And this is what, of course, was the topic of debate between Stephen Douglas
Right.
and Lincoln. And of course, that was also got him tremendous amount of publicity. But the Cooper Union speech was the one that won him over New York, which really was the powerhouse politically of the nation and determined often the politics of the nation. He won the hearts and minds of the New York Republicans in talking about, as opposed to might makes right, which is what the slave power believed in. He talked about right makes might, and it was interesting that prior to those remarks, he was talking about the fact that the slave power resented the fact that the North and the Union did not believe in the positive good of slavery, that they didn't support the slave system, and they didn't acknowledge how good the slave system was. And that's why Lincoln said that right makes might. We know what it is. Give us the course and the resolve to follow through with it. And of course, we see this today, even with the Democratic Party, with those who disagree with them. They vilify, they demonize, they still do the same, hold the same. Really, they apply the same thinking now as they did then with that positive good theory. And this is really what precipitated Lincoln's remarks, that it wasn't might that made right. And he even said, he said, these people want us to acknowledge that slavery is right, but we can't do that because right makes might.
Right. Let me throw in a little anecdote about William Seward and Lincoln. They had met once, I think, before the presidential election, William Seward and Lincoln. So when Seward lost the nomination, he sent his right-hand man, Thurlow Weed, to Springfield, Illinois, to meet Lincoln. Hey, Lincoln, what's Lincoln? Talk to him. And they sat down for about 2 hours. And Thurlow Weed, remember, had known Seward for 30 years, had backed him for governor, to be the boy governor in the 1830s. He was totally for Seward. And and William Seward had, when Thurlow Weed arrived, William Seward said, well, remember, Thurlow Weed had devoted his life to Seward. He said, well, what about Lincoln? And Thurlow Weed looked him right in the eye and said, quote, Abraham Lincoln is the finest man I ever met. I mean, that's just magnificent.
Yeah. And wasn't Thurlow Weed he was really the big machine Republican leader of New York City, wasn't he not?
Yeah, he was a big newspaper guy. And again, one of these unsung heroes that made it all happen. And, to me, go ahead. That story tells me everything you need to know about Lincoln and all his rivals.
Yeah, there's no question about it. And of course, William Seward was considered a Republican, or a conservative rather, in contrast to the radical Republicans of Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, who wanted immediate abolishment of slavery. Seward was more and more conservative about the approach. He detested slavery, but he knew that it was going to be very difficult to move it. And it's amazing, of course, Lincoln surrounding himself and listening to all these men, and all these men in his ear. And he was the one who's deciphering all these ideas and all these suggestions. And he did so masterfully in exemplifying prudence and moderation, which is something that we've talked about with our good friend, Professor John Shaft, in his book, Abraham Lincoln's Statesmanship and the Limits of Liberal Democracy. So Lincoln truly was extraordinary, and he surrounded himself and listened to a lot of extraordinary men.
Oh, yeah. Now, another theme from the book and from this chapter, A Grand New Party, is Democrat historians greatly overemphasize dissension between Lincoln and the other Republicans and the radicals. They make it out that all they did was fight. And that that's part of the whole thing of Lincoln was really a Democrat. It's absurd. What they forget is, yes, Lincoln argued with the radicals and people to his right as well all the time. What they admit, the fact is, Lincoln didn't even talk to Democrats, like ever. I mean, while he was president, you could probably add up the substantive conversations he had with Democrats in the fingers of two hands. He didn't even talk to those people. They were slave people and Confederates, and he had no time for them whatsoever, or even the loyal ones. He's like, guys, you got us into this mess. He didn't even talk to Democrats. His discussions were all within the party. And Charles Sumner, who again clashed quite a bit openly with Lincoln, they were pals. They went to the theater and went on carriage rides together, and then they would duke it out publicly, but they're all on the same team. They're all on Team America, Team USA, and Team GOP. So it's wildly
And
overstated
Michael,
that these guys fought as much as they did. Go ahead.
no, I was just going to interject. Very recently, I found out that Charles Sumner was actually holding Abraham Lincoln's hand on his deathbed prior to his expiration. Of course, we're going to be sharing a great speech that Charles Sumner gave in honor of Lincoln just a few months later in June to a Boston Historical Society. It's called The Declaration of Independence and Abraham Lincoln.
You're
We're actually
freezing.
going to be we're actually going to be reading that, but I found it very interesting how Charles Sumner grew to love Lincoln and had a great amount of admiration for him,
Yeah.
as well as many others did, because he was so tragically and cruelly and brutally murdered.
Right.
So of course that had something to do with the sentiment, but it's truly remarkable. Men like Thaddeus Stevens, of course, he had a tremendous influence on Lincoln. It came about that a lot of the policies that Thaddeus Stevens was promoting, eventually Lincoln agreed to. And of course, it was Thaddeus Stevens who really kept Lincoln's legacy alive and drove the passage of the 14th and then the 15th Amendments. I mean, that was all Thaddeus Stevens. And if it wasn't for Thaddeus Stevens to take up the cause that Lincoln had promoted, of course, which Thaddeus Stevens initially promoted to begin with, then we wouldn't have had these great Republican victories without the persistence of Thaddeus Stevens and men like Charles Sumner.
That's absolutely right. And another thing worth mentioning about Thaddeus Stevens, he was he was chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee. There was no majority leader, so he was the majority leader basically. He picked the speaker. He said, "You're going to be speaker." In those days, the House Ways and Means Committee did Ways and Means. Means it did taxation, or did expenditures and taxation. And only later, after Stevens died, they divided the House Ways and Means Committee into 3 committees: appropriations, House Ways and Means, and banking. So he was so tremendously powerful. So not just in his discourses with Abraham Lincoln, but in setting economic policy. And another thing is, Lincoln spent most of his time on the war. There were all these tremendous legislative advances during the Civil War that he really had nothing to do with, or didn't want anything to do. He just approved them because he was a busy guy.
Yeah.
The railroad to the Pacific, the National Banking Act, on and on and on and on, were all products pretty much of Thaddeus Stevens and his congressional team. And again, you'll read historians who say, Lincoln built the railroad to the Pacific. It was a Republican legislative victory. And of course, he signed it. He was for it. But I mean, Congress ran the show on domestic policy in those days. And
that's right. And also, Michael, just let me interject that you could essentially argue that Lincoln was providing constitutional Republican ideal and philosophy and allowing the legislative branch to work as the way James Madison and the founders intended it. It is Article 1. The Congress was given the absolute authority to make law and legislation. Of course, this has been completely emasculated, if you will, by FDR and Woodrow Wilson, the progressives of the 20th century. So we have a totally different understanding of the presidency, whereas Lincoln understood what his role was.
Right.
And it was to acquiesce to the Congress, and it was to enforce the laws that they voted into law.
Correct. Yeah, that was very much Congress not only respected its position vis-a-vis the presidency, but it also respected its position vis-a-vis the people. Meaning, every 2 years we have a new Congress, and we're going to then sit down and decide what's to be done. Whereas, look at what just happened recently with this $1 trillion+ deal. They just agreed to spend 10 years worth of spending out for 10 years. Or whatever, 5 years, 10 years worth of spending right now. So they'd done the job of the next 4 Congresses, basically. Whereas that would never even occurred to Republicans to do that then. They said, we're going to appropriate this, and we'll think about it. We'll have an election. We'll think about something else later. But anyway, so I talk about in the book back to basics for the Republican Party. During this chapter on the formation of the party called the Grand New Party, how it was a team effort.
Mhm.
And the objective was to save the Constitution and save the country from the Democratic Party.
Mhm.
And it went very, very well. Lincoln relied on a lot of good people to carry the weight for him. Congress
Mhm.
understood its role. And another thing is, you hear Democrat historians say, "Isn't it ironic, or isn't it odd or strange that even though there was a war going on, Congress was able to pass all this wonderful legislation? Isn't that strange?" It wasn't strange at all. It happened because most Democrats had left Congress to fight for the Confederacy. That's all it was. So they
Mhm.
had,
That's right.
most Democrats leaving Congress, it left the Republicans pretty much to do what they wanted. And what did they do? They crushed their enemies. They installed a dictatorship, like sort of is being done now. No, they created the foundation for the modern American economy.
That's right. And in light of this fine chapter that we're discussing today, Grand New Party, I did want to show the audience, Michael, the initial reading just a bit. Let me get that back. Just a couple of the items that were mentioned in the first party platform of 1856. And the first resolution was that the maintenance of the principles promulgated in the Declaration of Independence and embodied in the federal Constitution are essential to the preservation of our Republican institutions, and that the federal Constitution, the rights of the states, and the union of the states must and shall be preserved. So there we have what Lincoln said in 1854, Michael, in that speech at Bloomington. He said, "Let us readopt the principles of the Declaration of Independence." And howbeit, we see in the very first resolution of the very first party platform of the Republican Party in 1856, we read that the maintenance of the principles promulgated in the Declaration of Independence were to be the foundation by which the Republican Party would be founded, and its philosophy. And that, in my estimation, and I know you agree with me, needs to be readopted once again by the Republican Party.
Correct. Absolutely right.
And of course, the rest of the platform, Michael, has a lot to do with the situation in Kansas. Of course, Bleeding Kansas was a huge issue in 1856, the atrocities that were going on in Kansas. And that had a lot to do with the makeup and some of the points brought up in this party platform was the deprivation of free speech, which of course is a First Amendment right, the rights of Second Amendment. People were having weapons confiscated and taken from them, and they're losing their ability to self-preserve. So there are all sorts of different violations of constitutional rights that were going on in Kansas, and this Republican Party was created to restore, as you say, defending the Constitution, and all derived from protecting and restoring, and as Lincoln said, readopting the principles of the Declaration of Independence. And what are they? They speak of the laws of nature and nature's God, the self-evident truth that all men are created equal, the unalienable God-given rights of among these being life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and then the consent of the governed. Governed allow themselves to be governed as long as the government is protecting their person and their property. And that essentially is a summary of what those principles of the Declaration of Independence are all about.
As I mentioned in my book, Lincoln would sometimes begin his speeches with the phrase, he would say, "All honor to Jefferson." He would just begin when he gave extemporaneous campaign speeches and so forth to local groups. That's how he would begin. He would say, "All honor to Jefferson," and then he would begin. So, he totally meant it. And it's just sad to think, well, let's be more positive. it's a great opportunity for the Republican Party to recapture and appreciate and celebrate its heritage. That is the key. And as I've said, I think in the first chapter or in the first program, how can a salesman be an effective salesman if he doesn't care about the product? Or how can a diplomat be effective if she doesn't care about her country? Well, how can Republicans be effective if we don't care about our organization and what it's done?
Very true. And the next time we're going to be reading The Rules by Which We Live, which is a fascinating chapter, chapter 3. And really, it'll go back into these, we'll talk about these principles that we've talked about in the Declaration of Independence that really became the philosophical foundation for the Republican Party. But Michael, let's talk about how important it is as we conclude. And I would say that if you're a Republican and if you're running for representative office, or if you're a Republican voter, either way, you need to get this book, purchase it, read it, begin to understand your party's principles and heritage. Follow the daily blog posts that Mike puts up, giving us information about Republicans who we've never heard of, who lived wonderful lives and exemplified our Republican Party principles. You know, for too long, Michael, you understand this, and many Republicans do. We've been on the defensive. We've allowed the Democrats to take the high ground.
Right.
Well, the time now is for us to recapture the high ground, if you will. And I believe that it begins, and we'll talk about this in future episodes, with the moral high ground. After all, we'll read in another party platform that the party was against the two relics of barbarism known as slavery and polygamy, which became an issue in Utah.